Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Danny Doyle from AccessPay, and I'm here to present our first in our live webinar series, Operating in the New Normal, 5 Tips for Remote Finance Teams. I think it goes without saying that the last couple of weeks have been a challenge for us all, switching to remote working, dealing with being in our homes a little more than usual. It's presented a unique set of challenges, indeed for ourselves and for our customers. The idea for this webinar came from a lot of conversations we've had with our customers over the past couple of weeks in terms of helping them prepare for the new normal. And as such, we thought we'd extend that sage advice out to perhaps some organisations that weren't our customers. Before we get started, I just want to thank our partners at Pro Manchester for supporting this event and indeed inviting so many of the guests we've got on this afternoon. There'll be some housekeeping first of all. Be about 45 minutes, including questions and answers at the end. You will be muted throughout the session, although if you do have any questions, there is a little Q&A box on the side. I'm happy to take questions throughout the session, or you can save them till the end. The webinar recording will be made available to everyone as well, along with the slides, and I hope you find it useful. So I'm Danny Doyle, I'm Senior Product Manager at AccessPay. I look after our payment and cash management solutions and our bank connectivity products. What that means is we help our corporate customers connect their financial systems to their banks and vice versa. It's a bit of a rough agenda for today. So we want to talk you through five essential tips for remote working. The reason we've decided to host this event, we have a number of cloud-based payment and cash management products. So the fact that they were born in the cloud means they are already at a slight advantage to some more legacy systems. And like I said earlier, we've been working really hard to support our customers through this change as they too move to. So we'll go through mapping out some of the processes that you have for your payments and cash management systems, how you transfer data to them, how you access different web-based products, understanding who the users of those systems are and who their backups are, how you release your payments to your banks, and then finally some backup plans and alternative solutions. And we'll have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. Cool, so tip number 1, and this is absolutely critical for us, it's document and map out your payments and collections processes. Why is it so important? Well, our service delivery model at AccessPay means we engage with 2 types of what we call a persona at the customer side, and they're generally split between service delivery contacts, so day-to-day users of the system, and security contacts, who are usually administrators or IT people or senior finance people. And what that means is we get a very specific or niche view of how our customers use our products and services. And what we find is if our key contact is from the accounts payable team, then perhaps we might not get as much information on how their payroll users use the system. If somebody is responsible for accounts receivable, so things like direct debits, then they might not necessarily have a view on how payroll and accounts payable is processed. And that's with very good reason. Segregation of visibility at a process level is clearly something really important for maintaining a secure payments process. But where this is all leading to is you may, in fact, have a very good idea of how your department uses banking, payment services, and all the rest of it. But there might not be anyone at your organization that has a holistic view overall of how you make payments to suppliers, how you make payments to your staff, how you collect money, how you pay expenses, and other kinds of business payments. So we think it's really important that at least one person at your organization, usually someone in IT or somebody senior from finance, takes responsibility for putting together quite a sophisticated, I guess, document and process map that contains all of your payments and collections processes. So how do you do that? Well, the most important thing to consider is which systems actually generate these files, or which systems generate API calls, or whatever it is. to transfer data to your bank, to transfer data to your payment software providers, or wherever else that financial data might go. The reason that's so important is ultimately if you can't send an instruction to your bank or your payment software provider, there's not going to be much they can do about helping you make a payment. So understanding which those systems are is critical. Now, some of our smaller customers will just use a small business sort of accounting package like Xero or QuickBooks. And they may only have one other system, something like a CRM system for collecting payments. But straight away, when you look at that, you've got a dependency on two systems. And if they aren't secured, if they aren't maintained, if they aren't both hosted in as robust a way as they need to be, then you can have an issue where you're going to be able to collect payments, but perhaps not pay them out. So looking at which systems generate those files is really, really important. Then you've got to look at what they do with those files and that data that they generate. So which systems actually handle the transfer, the transfer of data to and from the payment systems? Is there a file transfer program that you use? And what does that file transfer program do? Perhaps most critical of all, especially in today's climate, is who are the key users of your system and what are their roles? Because while your systems may be accessible from home, whilst they may be up, you might not be suffering any downtime. If you're stuck with a situation where perhaps you have a number of users that can enter or extract financial data from those systems, but there is a built-in approval process where there's nobody around who can access the system to approve it, clearly there is a point of failure there, which try as you might, you can enter as much data as you want, but if you can't get it out of that system, then there's a single point of failure that needs to be addressed. There's another point to consider as well on not only how the data is transferred, but how it's secured. So many of our customers use encryption and they'll upload encrypted data into our environment. Now, with good reason, we will configure our system so that we only expect encrypted files. Again, that's a security measure. But if there is a problem with your ability to encrypt data and the person you're sending to is expecting it to be encrypted or signed or whatever other security mechanism you might put on that, if there is a single point of failure with your ability to encrypt or sign data, then it sounds like the person that you're sending that to isn't going to be able to process that file with good reason. So the key question to ask yourself is, do you really understand how your organization uses BACS, uses online banking, how you make international payments, and what are those payment types that perhaps don't sit within your direct area of responsibility that you need to understand more so that you can identify those single points of failure? And finally, there's an idea being pushed by the ACT, the Association of Corporate Treasurers, and they want this idea of every organization will have an internal payments champion. And that payments champion will be responsible for understanding at a real deep level how that organization makes payments, collects payments, and manages their cash. So do you have an internal person responsible for owning that holistic view of making payments and collecting money? So that's the first one, and it's the most important. So document and map out your payments and collections processes. The reason it's so important is some of the other tips we're going to talk through today rely on that document or that process map. So the next one, use your process to identify key points of failure with data access, transfer, and security. And that builds upon one of the things I've just mentioned. So quite often these systems, because they're handling financial data that's obviously really important to your organization as it protects your bottom line, because these are very, very secure systems, well, sometimes security can be something that bites you on the backside, because the more you secure a process, the more dependencies there are in that process. So using that process map, again, look at how those files are generated and understand the points of failure. Ask yourself the question of, in a disaster recovery scenario, I mean, it sounds like everyone on this webinar will have at least experienced a little bit of remote working, but in a disaster recovery scenario where colleagues are not available, do I have the right people in my organization to approve data for release from my source systems, release data and generate files? Do I have the right systems or people in place to transfer those files securely around my network? And that third sub-bullet point there is really, really important. So as everybody's made this move to working from home, the IT managers and the IT staff of the UK are really working hard to get everybody in their organization connected and available. Ways that access is secured is through something called a VPN. So it's a virtual private network. So what that means is you'll connect to your organization's servers and applications and infrastructure from home. If you rely on being on that VPN in order to make payments or collections, then clearly being able to do that could not being able to do that could prevent you from being able to make time critical payments. The same question applies to file transfer and also encryption, as mentioned previously. So the second tip there really is building on the process map, but more from the point of view of accessing it is one thing, but making sure that the process is as secure as possible is absolutely critical. So what are those key points of failure? Can everybody who needs to access my data, can I transfer that data out of my environment? And is that process just as secure as it was when I was in the? If it's not, then you want to make positive steps towards making sure it is. And there's a couple more points there on data transfer. So if I am reliant on one program or one mechanism or one process for transferring files, what alternatives do I have? So in a business as usual scenario, you may rely on a file transfer program, you may rely on some other things that you have within your infrastructure for sending and receiving data. What backup plans do I have in place? So do I have the ability in a DR scenario for manually uploading data, banking portal, or manually uploading data to my payment software provider? If I don't, and should I explore it? Well, yes, but clearly what we need to consider is that if you're using a backup plan, that needs to be just as secure as your business as usual process. So make sure there are controls around those manual uploads. Make sure it's only senior people that can carry them out, or make sure there are sufficient controls around data privacy and segregation of visibility. So just because you're in a remote working scenario, just because you're in a DR scenario, that shouldn't mean that all of a sudden those controls go away. So using that process map, make sure you've documented who has which user permissions, what data privacy controls there are, because potentially if somebody's manually uploading a file rather than use a typical file transfer program, if somebody's manually uploading a file, they've potentially got the ability to look in that file. So is it encrypted would be another question that you should ask yourself. And the final point there really is the payment data or the format of last resort. So one of the things some of our customers have asked us to do is they've said, look, I want to make sure that even if my accounts payable on my payroll system is unavailable from home, I want to be able to put a template together in Excel that in a disaster recovery scenario will enable me to get data into your system only needing Excel in a web browser. So clearly that's something that we do and should support. But you'd argue that something that's manually put together in Excel should be subject to even more controls than even your disaster recovery plan. But ask yourselves, what are those plans? Have I documented them? What additional controls have I put around a backup plan? And if I do want to use the third option of using an Excel template, which probably strikes fear in the minds of a lot of you, make sure that that has even more supplementary controls than my business as usual and my DR plan. So the next point, use your process map to identify how access can be maintained, how access can be extended, but most importantly, how it can be secured. So we're in a scenario at the moment where we've talked about everybody's remote working. We're perhaps connecting to your business infrastructure from home. We've talked about how data can be extracted from your environment and sent on to where it needs to go, such as online banking or payment software or whatever. All of that is absolutely pointless if you don't have the right users or you don't have the right access to the systems that you're critically reliant upon. So have all users tried accessing the interface from home? I imagine most of them will, but if there are any users that don't routinely access these systems, have they at least tried to log in from home? Have they tried to log in using a virtual private network, if that's one that you do, if that's a program, a process that you do use? And look at the software packages that actually enable my access. So payment software providers, online banking systems, they'll quite often require add-on programs, such as Gemalto, which is used for smart card signing. There might be some browser add-ons required. You might have a file transfer program that's required to get that data into those systems. So this is really a question about accessing web products from home, because I know a lot of customers will, and a lot of people have been provided with laptops and things like that, but not everyone will have been. So we're in a scenario where quite a lot of organizations are implementing what's called a BYOD policy, a bring your own device policy. So what does that mean? Well, we've got customers that went from having highly secured, highly restricted and encrypted corporate environments to now having customers at home accessing these systems via their own iPads or via their own laptops. So if they are going to be accessing these systems from home, are they prepared in terms of supplementary sort of software packages, browser add-ons, access to file transfer programs? Have I got enough access even though I'm using my own device? Another couple of points to mention. So is access restricted by IP? Again, we're in a scenario where everyone's gone from all being in the same office to now accessing work environments and payments and cash management products from home. Quite a lot of our customers ask us to restrict access to their version of AccessPay by IP. Well, if they're not connected to their corporate VPN, if they're using their own home Wi-Fi, potentially their IP address has changed, or almost definitely their IP address has changed. So if we've got customers where access to our product is restricted by IP, quite simply they won't be able to access services because they're on a different IP address. And a final point there, and this is something that's recommended by the National Cybersecurity Centre, and we'll talk a bit more about them towards the end of the webinar. How do users authenticate? So when they log in and when they access those services like online banking and other payment software, is that access secured through authentication? So every user of online banking will appreciate there are these little tokens, there are card readers, there are PIN sentries and all sorts of devices that the banks use that force a user to have a second factor of authentication in addition to username and password. So while talking about preserving or extending access to the web interface, ensure that that too is secured and enhanced via something like a multi-factor authentication. So that means a user would need to plug in a token that's issued to them by the finance or the IT team, or they must download a smartphone app at the very least to make sure that now everybody's accessing these systems from disparate locations, that you don't open the door for fraudsters or potential bad actors in your payments process. So the next point is really, so we've talked about your internal network and how that generates data. We've talked about how that data gets out of your network and ends up somewhere else. And now we've talked about how users access that somewhere else, whether it's payment software, whether it's online banking. The next point is really understand all of your system users. Who are they? What are their roles? What are their permissions and who are their backups? And this is a really prevalent point in a remote working scenario, because, and we've had it at AccessPay. So all of a sudden now, users of our software that have never needed to log in before, perhaps they're the financial director or the financial controller who doesn't day-to-day use payment software, but is there as a backup. All of a sudden, they're coming to us and asking, look, I was meant to be trained on the software. I was meant to learn it way back when. I never bothered because I have John and Jill who do that for me. I really need to understand how this system works. So look at who those users are. Look at how many you have if you pay a license per user. Ensure all of those users have tried to log in. Ensure they've set or created passwords. If they haven't logged in for a while, it's very likely that those passwords have expired. And this is another really important point. If you've got inactive users or you've got lapsed users, perhaps that you set up from a year, from 6 months ago, from 2 years ago, make sure you deactivate or delete those users, because we're in a really awkward and unfortunate scenario now where a lot of companies have had to lay off staff. A lot of companies have furloughed members of staff. And I can guarantee you not every organisation that has furloughed staff has properly followed their leavers policy, which would dictate that access to those critical financial systems be revoked immediately before that person's walked out the door. And another point is just consider refresher training for backup users. Like I say, people are going to be using these systems who don't normally do it. They might never have used the systems. They might be a new user, actually. So if they are a backup user, and you need to be able to rely on them if somebody's taken ill or somebody can't access the system, make sure those users have been trained and are ready to pick up the baton if needed in a contingency scenario. Another really important point, admin users that you have. So these systems are often really, really secure with good reason, as I've said. And admin users are either usually quite active in the systems or they're only called upon when something needs changing. Now, that might be really frequent in a big business or it might be really infrequent in a small business. So what happens sometimes with our products is we'll set up 1 or 2 admin users in the beginning, and we'll get a request after the customer's been using the software for a year or 2, and we'll say, oh, well, we need to speak to your admin user. And they'll say, oh, Janine, yep, she left the organization 18 months ago. And that leaves us in a real bind because we have a person that is supposed to be the person we take instruction from that now we can't verify the authority of the request we're receiving. So at the very least, ensure that you have enough admin users and that those are as current as they need to be. Ask yourself to use as part of my backup plan. Obviously, that doesn't mean open up access to the entire business. It needs to be a controlled process. But if there are people that have left, people that have been let go, reduce that number of active users and then start to look at, okay, using that process map, now I've identified some single points of failure. I need 1 more person in payroll, or I need 1 more person in accounts payable, or whatever that is. And just ask, do you have enough users to perform the key actions to release a file if 1 or more of those people was made unavailable? And this is another point that we see all the time. Generally, it's the same bunch of users that will always use the system, but if 1 or 2 of them is unavailable or is taken ill or whatever, who is their backup? And do you have enough users to perform those critical actions, like getting data into your systems, like approving data in the bank system or your payment software, and also submitting it? And the final one's really, really important because if you are opening up access, if you are accessing systems from home, if you are perhaps following a different process than you normally do, can I, at the click of a button, access a log of system activity? Who's accessing the system? Transactions have been processed, and can I access my bank statements? And this is really to be able to quickly identify any fraudulent or anomalous access, fraudulent or anomalous activity, but ultimately being able to reconcile those bank statements and those transactions you expected to have made. Okay, and this one's really important, and everyone hates doing this, but it's absolutely critical to your financial process. So we strongly suggest maintaining an inventory of cards, of certificates or tokens or whatever it is that you use to prove to your bank that you are who you say you are when you put that digital signature on a payment instruction. Maintain an inventory of which of those devices you have out there. Again, really, really prevalent because we've had customers of ours that have said, the office has gone into complete lockdown. and I left my smart card in my drawer and I can't access it. What are my options? And ultimately, there aren't many. I mean, we could set up an alternative channel, but people don't really want to be leaving their house to go out and grab a token or grab a card that they'd left in the office. So maintain that inventory, make sure it's up to date, and you know who has what and where, because there are potentially some huge points of failure when it comes to card certificates and tokens. So is there a log of active tokens and cards, and does access need to be expanded? Do we need to order our financial director a spare card because she's let it expire because she never used the system? Have I actually got too many tokens and cards out there, and do I need to perhaps revoke some of that access? Similarly, if you need tokens or physical hardware to access these systems, do I have an adequate number? Even if you might have a card, but you might not have brought a card reader home with you. Asking yourself these questions is really important, because you may be stuck in a scenario where, try as they might, your bank or your payment software provider just can't help you get a file out the door because you've left your card in the office or your reader's broke or whatever. So have I got enough, and have I got backups? And start to ask what is your backup plan in case of a hardware or software issue. So if one user has that hardware or software issue, who else can pick up the slack there and take their place and do it? And what is your process around it? Another one is asking yourself what your alternative options are. So if you were in a scenario where you weren't able to release a BACS file, or you weren't able to submit a CHAPS transaction through your online banking system, what are the alternative options? And you can get to a point where this is absolute overkill if you want, but the best contingency on online banking is have another bank account with another bank, right? But there are some actual practical and pragmatic solutions that you can take. If you do only have one bank, look at and you do BACS software, for example. If that online banking channel and that BACS software doesn't present a sufficient enough contingency plan, then you can start to look at alternative options like BACS bureaus. So not many people are familiar with BACS bureaus, but everyone uses them. They do the vast majority of people's BACS payrolls, so that's kept separate from a lot of processes. And these are organizations, and we operate a BACS bureau too, in addition to the software we do. These sorts of organizations will generally be able to offer a contingency solution for if you had a direct debit file that was critical to go out and you just couldn't get it out because your online banking system didn't accept the format, your payment software, you couldn't access it because Fred was taken ill. Start to look at some of these bureau providers as just a vendor that you can have on standby for if that access isn't possible through your business as usual channel. Can I give my file to someone else and get them to submit it for me? If you do, try and make sure that process is as secured and encrypted and all the other elements we've just been through. But start to look at what those alternative options are, because people always think, oh, it won't happen to me. And I'm sure a lot of people didn't think that the nation would switch to working from home overnight and that we'd all be sat in our houses 24/7 for a month. And there are alternative methods of submitting through AccessPay and other providers. If you miss a BACS run, we can turn your BACS file into a faster payments file or whatever. But just ask these questions of ourselves or of the providers that you have. And this is the final one. So understanding what those backup plans are and making sure they're as secure as your BAU. So what is my routine contingency plan? If I typically submit payments through provider A, and my backup plan to that is, oh, well, we never have an issue, but I know that I can always go to Lloyd's online and I can key in that payments data. Well, while that might be fine, keying in data is clearly not as secure as extracting it from a system and encrypting it and sending it in a secure and encrypted way. So have I asked myself these same questions for online banking, for bureau solutions, and for manual payments as well? So look at that routine contingency plan and ask yourself, is that as secure as I need it to be? Is it as efficient as I need it to be? And if not, what are my options around I'm potentially looking at another. And like I just mentioned, if you do miss a critical payments run, there is always the option that your bank or your payment software provider or someone like ourselves can turn that BACS file into something like a faster payments file, so that you might have missed the Wednesday process for Friday payment, but at least then you've got another day to get that data into a system that can make that payment by faster payments. Okay, so that was it for the core content of the webinar. I just wanted to run you through some of the next steps from our side. So, as I mentioned at the top of the session, we will send out a webinar recording. We will send out these slides, and I've got some helpful links on here. Both of these come from the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is a government organisation charged with providing advice on avoiding cybercrime and avoiding fraud. Now, there was some guidance issued on home working, which is really, really important. If you follow that link, you can download a PDF. But it was actually really interesting to see that the National Cybersecurity Centre issued a follow-up bit in response to COVID-19. And what they'd identified was that all of a sudden there has been a real sharp rise in phishing scams, in other types of scams, because fraudsters have realized that people are all at home. They might be outside their comfort zone. They might be distracted. They might not be using the typical systems, controls, and processes that they would in their office. And the amount of attempted frauds has gone through the roof, whether that's phishing or other types of cybercrime aimed at duping you into making a payment. So it's really important that you read those. And following on from that, we've got a link to the government's Take 5 initiative as well. And that's some real basic information that we recommend all of your finance teams look at. And it's just about, if you believe there is something iffy or something wrong with somebody asking you to make a certain payment, then it's some really basic controls and questions that you can ask yourself to potentially avoid falling victim of fraud. Like I say, we'll issue out the webinar recording, we'll issue out the slides as well, and you can share those with your organization. And if you did want to speak to us about how your organization currently makes payments, we're happy to provide a free consultation and help you enhance your processes and DR plans to make sure that you can continue to operate your payments and cash management services from home. And we do have a sample process mapper that you can use. We give this to some of our customers when they're coming on board, when they want to really map out how they intend to use AccessPay. It's really useful for us because it helps us program their system automatically. But if you do want to use that process mapper, that's of course fine. It's free of charge. And it might just help your organization better prepare this remote working scenario or this remote working nightmare that we're all working through. So we're nearly at the end. I'd just like to open out to some questions. I know we've got a number of people on the call. So please feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A box. Okay, so we've got a question that's come through now. So one person's asked, my organization uses smart cards for my online banking system and BACS software. Is there an alternative to using this smart card? I've paraphrased a little bit there. Yes, there is. So I mentioned just now that potentially you can look at a BACS bureau to process your BACS payments for you. That does involve getting another person in this. It may not be something you have the appetite for doing at the moment. There is an alternative to smart cards that can be used, and it's something called a HSM. So any bank that gives you access to BACS will also give you access to something called a HSM. So a HSM is it's a copy of the digital certificate that lives on your smart card. And instead of it being on a card, the way we do it is it's installed in our data center. What that means, though, is that if you have users that want to be able to submit backs either on the move or without relying on physical hardware, they can quite simply at the click of a button deliver those files through to backs or through to the bank. Now, what you might be asking is, oh, well, that doesn't sound as secure as smart card, and it's a fair question. So the way we set up these controls is we put a specific workflow in the system so that at least one person has to approve that data. And we use a smartphone app and token system to make sure that that user has to authenticate their access before they log into the system. But that's something that can avoid you relying on cards, on hardware, on pins and locally installed software. Okay, we've got another question there. Okay, so another question. I'm going to guess this person has a number of banks. So the question is, what can I do about the amount of tokens and fobs I need to contend with my online banking systems? Very good question. It's probably a problem that exists for larger businesses with multiple banks and probably applies less to sort of SMEs and anyone with a lower turnover. So one of the things that a lot of businesses come to us to do is they have a number of online banking systems, and they might either be a UK domiciled business with operations elsewhere, or they might have a finance or a treasury operation in the UK or in Europe. And what that means is they quite often have to access online banking systems around the world, or at the very least, they'll have a number of different online banking systems they need to log into to make payments or to retrieve their statements and then subsequently collate that data. It's a problem that we hear all the time. So we can potentially look at a solution. So we have a solution that will enable you to connect to all of those banks really simply, and you can just have one token, one channel to send and receive your payments data and retrieve that cash management information. We realize that, of course, the more banks you have, the bigger that problem is, because each bank has their own token, their own process, and their own way of doing things. So what we like to suggest with our customers is if you route that information through AccessPay, you can get one process across the board. We can help you sort of systematically enforce that process so that every payment that comes through our system follows the same internal governance rules, and you have access to all the same sort of data all from one place, I guess, rather than having to go into those individual online banking systems. I don't think we have any more questions. Just give everyone a last chance. No, perfect. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining me this afternoon. Best of luck with the challenging times that we have ahead. Of course, as I said before, we will send out the slide deck. We'll send out a recording of the webinar. We'd love it if you could share that with your teams. And if you do have any questions, you can reach me at danny.doyle@accesspay.com. Always happy to help give you some advice on how your organization's set up for payments and collections. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye.